On a July afternoon so bright it turned the asphalt white, Ethan Cole pulled his battered pickup truck to the curb in front of his mother's house in Millbrook, Virginia. The engine ticked as it cooled. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring at the front porch where he had learned to tie his shoes, where his father had taught him the names of constellations on summer nights that felt a lifetime ago. A military backpack sat on the passenger seat, olive drab, scuffed, heavy with 14 months of sand and silence. He stepped out, slung it over one shoulder, and that was when he saw her. A woman stood in the yard next door, watering a row of red roses along a white picket fence. She had long blonde hair that caught the sunlight, and she wore a pale blue dress that moved in the warm breeze. She looked up, and her face broke into a wide smile. She raised her free hand and waved. "Welcome home, Ethan," she called. He stopped walking. He had never seen this woman before in his life. But she knew his name. He stood there, squinting against the glare, trying to place her in some memory that would not come. She turned off the hose and walked toward the fence. "I'm Claire," she said. "Claire Ashford. I moved in a little over a year ago. Your mom and Owen talk about you all the time." She said it lightly, but there was a warmth behind it that Ethan did not know how to receive. He nodded once and said, "Thanks," in a voice still rough from the long drive. Then he turned and walked up the porch steps without looking back. The screen door groaned when he pulled it open. Inside, the house smelled the way it always had: lemon cleaner and coffee and something baking. Owen was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, bent over a sheet of paper, a crayon in his small fist. Margaret sat in the recliner beside him, reading glasses perched on her nose. The boy heard the door and looked up. He was 6 years old, and he had his father's brown eyes. For 3 full seconds he did not move. Then the crayon fell from his hand and he was running, bare feet slapping the hardwood, and he threw himself against Ethan's legs with a force that nearly buckled them. Ethan dropped his pack. He knelt and wrapped both arms around his son and held him tight, and Owen said, in a voice muffled against his father's shirt, "You came back." Margaret rose from her chair. She pressed her hand to her mouth and crossed the room and put her arms around both of them, and for a while the three of them stayed like that, tangled together in the afternoon light that poured through the front window. Owen did not let go of his father for the rest of the day. That evening, after the boy was in bed, Ethan sat across from his mother at the kitchen table and asked about the woman next door. Margaret poured him coffee and told him. Claire had arrived in Millbrook about 13 months ago, not long after Ethan shipped out. She was a widow. Her husband had died in a construction accident 2 years earlier. She worked as a nurse at the local clinic. She lived alone with a golden retriever named Biscuit, and somewhere along the way, without anyone planning it, she had become part of their lives. She brought groceries when Margaret's back was too stiff to drive. She picked Owen up from school on days when the pain was bad. She sat with him on her porch and let him play with the dog while Margaret rested. "She's been like family, Ethan," Margaret said. "Owen adores her." Ethan listened and said nothing. He stared at the dark window that faced Claire's house and felt something he could not name: gratitude, tangled with guilt, relief knotted with shame. A stranger had held his family together while he was gone, and he had not even known her name. He woke at 5 the next morning, the way he had woken every morning for the past 14 months, suddenly, completely, with his heart already beating fast. He pulled on jeans and a white t-shirt and went out to the porch with a cup of black coffee, and he sat on the top step and looked at the world he had come home to. The yard was overgrown. The grass reached his shins, threaded with dandelions and clover. The white picket fence between his mother's property and Claire's leaned at a tired angle, and several of the slats were missing or broken. The porch railing needed sanding, and the paint was peeling from the eaves in long, tired strips. He had been gone 14 months, and it showed in every sagging board and every weed that had taken root in his absence. Then he looked next door. Claire's yard was the opposite of theirs. The grass was trimmed. The flower beds along the fence were thick with roses, deep red, the color of old velvet, and the soil beneath them was dark and freshly turned. Her porch was swept clean, with a rocking chair and a small table. The golden retriever lay in a patch of sun near the steps, its tail moving slowly back and forth across the warm boards. The American flag on her porch post hung still in the early heat. Everything about her property spoke of someone who paid attention, someone who cared about the small things because the small things were all she had. Ethan looked from her yard to his and understood something that sat heavy in his chest. While he had been in a place where the sand got into everything, and the nights were loud with things he would spend years trying to forget, life here had continued, and a woman he did not know had kept it going. The screen door opened, and Owen padded out in bare feet and pajama shorts. He climbed into his father's lap and leaned against his chest. They sat together watching the morning fill the street with light. Then Owen lifted his head and looked toward Claire's house. His face changed. It opened the way a window opens when someone throws back the curtains. "Miss Claire," he called, waving both arms. "Daddy's home." Claire was on her porch, setting down a bowl for Biscuit. She looked up and waved back, smiling. Owen slid off Ethan's lap and looked at his father, asking permission with his eyes. Ethan nodded. "Go ahead." The boy ran across the yard and dropped to his knees beside the fence, and he wriggled through a gap between two leaning slats, a gap worn smooth, clearly his regular route, and popped up on the other side, already laughing as Biscuit bounded toward him. A little while later, Claire walked across her yard and stopped at the fence. She held a plate covered with a dish towel and a small glass jar. "Blueberry muffins," she said, "and strawberry jam. Margaret said these are your favorites." Ethan rose from the step and crossed the yard to take them. "Thank you," he said, and meant it, though the words came out flat and short. Claire did not linger or try to start a conversation. She nodded and turned to go, but at the fence she paused and looked back. "Owen counted the days until you came home," she said. "Every single one. He crossed them off on a calendar I made for him. 427 days. She said it, matter-of-factly, the way a nurse might report a patient's vitals, and then she stepped through the gap in the fence and walked back to her house. Ethan stood in the yard, holding the plate and the jar, watching her go, and he did not know what to do with any of it. That afternoon, while Owen napped on the couch with his head on Margaret's lap, Ethan walked down the hallway to his son's bedroom. The room was small and painted pale blue, neat the way grandmothers keep things neat, bed made with tight corners, shoes lined up by the door, books stacked on a low shelf. But the walls belonged to Owen. Drawings covered nearly every surface, taped up with loops of masking tape, crayon houses, stick-figure dogs, trees with enormous crowns, a sun with a smiling face in every one. Then Ethan saw the calendar. It hung beside Owen's bed, a large sheet of poster board divided into rows and columns with a ruler and a black marker. Each square held a date, written in Claire's neat handwriting, and through each one, Owen had drawn an X in crayon red, blue, green, whatever color he had picked up that day. Beneath the grid, in a child's shaky letters, it read, "X days until Daddy comes home. 427 squares, every one crossed off." Below the calendar was a drawing pinned with a thumbtack. A tall figure in brown and green, a soldier holding hands with a small figure in blue. Beside them stood a house with a white fence, and on the other side of the fence, a woman with yellow hair stood next to a garden of red circles that were clearly meant to be roses. At the bottom, Owen had written, "My dad coming home." Ethan stood in front of that drawing for a long time. He reached out and touched the edge of the paper with his fingertip. His hand was not steady. He understood now that Claire had not simply been a kind neighbor who brought muffins and watched a child. She had built a structure of hope for his son, one crossed-off day at a time, for over a year. She had given Owen something to hold on to when his father was on the other side of the world and his mother was already gone. He pressed his palm flat against the wall beside the drawing and closed his eyes and let himself feel the full weight of what this woman had done for his boy without asking for anything in return. That evening, Owen sat at the kitchen table working on a new drawing. When he finished, he held it up with both hands. "Look, Daddy." 4 people standing in front of 2 houses separated by a white fence. On the left, a tall man, a small boy, and an older woman with gray hair. On the right, a woman with yellow hair and a brown dog. Above them all, a giant sun smiled down. "That's you and me and Grandma," Owen said, pointing. "And that's Miss Claire and Biscuit." Then he looked at his father with serious brown eyes and asked, "Daddy, can Miss Claire come eat dinner with us? She always eats alone." Ethan looked through the kitchen window at the house next door. Through Claire's lit window, he could see her moving in her kitchen, a single figure setting a single plate on a small table. He looked back at Owen. "Sure, buddy. Go ask her." Owen was out the screen door before the sentence ended. 10 minutes later, Claire came through the front door carrying a bowl of coleslaw and a shy smile. Margaret set an extra place. Owen sat between his father and Claire, and he talked more during that meal than Ethan had heard him talk in years. Claire laughed at his jokes and cut his chicken into small pieces without being asked, and Margaret watched the table with a quiet expression that Ethan recognized but could not read, and Ethan watched all of it from his end of the table, quiet, studying Claire the way he might study a landscape that was new and unfamiliar, but somehow already felt like a place he had been before. In the days that followed, Ethan did what he knew how to do. He fixed things. He replaced the broken slats in the porch railing. He rehung the screen door so it no longer groaned. He tightened the leaking faucet and oiled every hinge until the doors swung silent. He pulled the weeds and mowed the grass and edged the walkway. He did not know how to sit still, and he did not know how to talk about the things that lived inside his chest, but he knew how to use his hands. Every repaired board, every painted surface, every tightened bolt was his way of saying, "I am here now. I am trying to make up for the time I was not." On the 4th day, Claire appeared at the fence. "I hate to ask," she said, "but my front steps have been getting worse. I patched them last winter, but I think they need someone who actually knows what they're doing." Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans. "I'll take a look." He gathered his tools and walked through the gap in the fence, and Owen trailed behind, already calling for Biscuit. The steps were worse than Claire had described. 2 treads were soft with rot, and the railing wobbled. He knelt and began pulling the damaged boards. While he worked, he could see into Claire's house through the open front door. It was clean and spare, a couch with a folded quilt, a bookshelf full of paperbacks, a small dining table with 2 chairs, one of which looked like it was never used. On a shelf near the window, he noticed a framed photograph. A young man with a wide grin, wearing a hard hat and a reflective vest, his arm around Claire. Her husband, the man who had gone to work one morning and never come home. Ethan looked at that photograph for only a moment, but it was enough. He recognized something in this house, the particular quiet of a place where someone had learned to live alone, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. He finished the steps in 2 hours. Claire brought him lemonade and sat on the railing while he tested each tread. "Good as new," he said. And she smiled and said, "Better than new. I'm pretty sure they were crooked when the house was built." It was the closest thing to a real conversation they had managed, and it ended naturally, and Ethan went back through the fence, feeling something he had not felt in a long time, useful. But the feeling did not last. He spent the next week driving to every garage, lumber yard, and repair shop within 30 miles, filling out applications in parking lots. He sat in interviews and tried to explain the 14-month gap in his employment without saying the word Afghanistan. Most of them looked at his hands, the way his fingers trembled when he set them on the table, and he could see the calculation behind their eyes, the quiet subtraction of his worth from the number they had hoped for. One foreman said they were not hiring. Another said they would call, which meant they would not. A third asked if he had any health issues, and when Ethan hesitated too long, the man thanked him for his service and showed him the door. That evening, he sat on the back steps and stared at his hands, willing them to be still. They would not listen. Claire came home from her shift. She saw him through the gap in the fence. She did not call out or come over. She simply left a paper bag on the fence post takeout from the diner on Main Street, still warm, and waved once and went inside. The nightmare came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after he had been home. In the dream, he was back in Kandahar, in a vehicle that was no longer moving, and the air was full of dust and noise, and a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. He could hear someone calling his name, but he could not find the door, and then the sound changed into something high and mechanical, and he was slamming his fist into something hard, and then he was awake, standing beside his bed, his right hand throbbing, a dent in the plaster wall. Sweat ran down his face. His chest heaved. Owen stood in the doorway in his pajamas, holding a stuffed bear by one arm, his face crumpled with fear. "Daddy?" Ethan crossed the room and knelt and pulled his son close. "I'm okay, buddy. Just a bad dream. I'm sorry I woke you up." Owen pressed his face into his father's neck, and Ethan could feel the boy trembling, and he hated himself in that moment with a precision that only a soldier who has frightened his own child can understand. Margaret appeared behind Owen, took his hand, and led him back to bed, murmuring in the low voice she had used when Ethan was small. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed and pressed his damaged hand against his forehead and tried to breathe. The dent in the wall stared back at him in the dark, a small crater that mapped the exact shape of everything he could not control. Next door, Claire had heard everything. Her bedroom window faced their house, and on summer nights when every window was open, sound carried easily. She heard the scream, the impact against the wall, the small voice that followed. She stayed in her bed. She knew from her years as a nurse, from the veterans she had treated, that you do not go to someone in the grip of a flashback uninvited. You do not touch them. You wait. The next morning, she came through the gap in the fence with 2 cups of coffee. She and Margaret sat on the porch while Owen played with Biscuit in the yard. Margaret's hands shook around her cup. Claire let the silence sit, then said quietly, "Rough night?" Margaret nodded, eyes red. Claire spoke carefully. "The VA clinic in town has a really good program. I work with a doctor there, Reeves. He's one of the best. If Ethan ever wants to go, I can make it easy. No red tape, no pressure." Margaret looked at her with gratitude and exhaustion. "I don't know if he'll go. He's like his father. He thinks asking for help is the same as admitting defeat." Later that morning, Owen sat on Claire's porch step, stroking Biscuit's ears. "Daddy screams sometimes," he said, without looking up. "At night, he says sorry after." Claire sat down beside him, lowering herself to his level. "Your daddy is the bravest person I know, Owen, and sometimes the bravest people need a little extra time to feel safe again. You help him feel safe. You know that, right?" Owen looked at her. "I do?" "Every single day," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to petting the dog. That evening, Ethan stood at the kitchen window, washing dishes. He could see Claire on her porch across the fence, reading in the last of the daylight, Biscuit asleep at her feet. The scene was so quiet, so ordinary, so completely unlike anything inside his own head, that he stood there longer than he meant to, his hands still in the warm water, watching the light fade around her. He wanted to walk across the yard and through the gap in the fence and sit on her porch step and say something. Anything but the distance between wanting and doing was a distance he did not yet know how to cross. The weeks found a rhythm. Ethan worked on the house during the day, sanding the porch, replacing the gutters, repainting the trim, and the sounds of his labor drifted through the open windows and across the fence. Claire left for the clinic each morning at 7 and came home each evening at 6, and somewhere along the way, the dinner at Margaret's table had stopped being an invitation and had become an assumption. No one had proposed it. It simply happened, the way seasons change gradually, and then all at once. Owen set 4 places without being told. Margaret cooked enough for 4 without counting, and Claire came through the front door each evening carrying something, a salad, a loaf of bread, a jar of pickles from the farmer's market, and took her seat as if she had always been there. Ethan began to talk to her. Not much, and not about anything that mattered, but more than before. He asked about her day at the clinic. He told her something funny Owen had said. He answered her questions about the house repairs with more than single syllables. Claire never pushed. She never asked about Afghanistan or the nightmares or the hands that trembled when he held his coffee cup. She talked to him directly, warmly, without the careful pity he had learned to recognize in other people's voices, the slight softening of tone, the averted eyes, the way they said, "Thank you for your service," as if the phrase were a door they could close between themselves and whatever lived behind it. Claire did not close doors, and Ethan found, to his own surprise, that he did not mind her presence, that she did not make him feel crowded or watched, that her silences were as comfortable as Margaret's. Then the letter came. It arrived on a Thursday in a long white envelope with a return address in Richmond. Ethan saw the name of the law firm and knew what it was before he opened it. He read it standing at the mailbox, then again on the porch steps. Megan, his ex-wife. She had remarried a house in the suburbs, a stable income, a new husband in insurance. And now she wanted Owen. The letter laid it out in the language of attorneys. The respondent lacked stable employment. The respondent had documented psychological conditions affecting his ability to provide a safe environment. The petitioner could offer a structured and financially secure home. Ethan read the word respondent and understood that it meant him. He read psychological conditions and understood that it meant the screams at 3 a.m. and the hands that shook and the dent in the bedroom wall. He sat on the porch steps with the letter in his lap and his eyes burning. He did not cry. He had not cried since before the deployment, and the mechanism for it seemed to have been removed, replaced by something harder that sat in his chest like a stone. He just sat there in the July heat and felt the world tilt. Claire's car pulled into her driveway at 6:10. She got out, saw him across the fence, and paused. She walked to the fence and rested her hands on the top rail. Bad day. Ethan was quiet for a long time. The cicadas screamed in the trees. Then he said, without looking at her, "She wants to take Owen." He did not explain who. He did not need to. Claire's hands tightened on the rail, but her voice stayed level. She did not offer advice or comfort or outrage. She opened the gap in the fence and walked across his yard and sat down beside him on the porch steps. She did not touch him. She did not speak. They sat together as the sky turned orange, and then purple, and then dark, and neither of them said another word. The next morning, Ethan was up before dawn, shaved and dressed in his one clean button-down shirt, driving 30 minutes to a garage in Culpeper that had posted a help-wanted sign. The owner was a big man with oil-stained hands who looked at Ethan's application and nodded at the military service. "We could use a guy who knows engines," he said. They walked onto the shop floor together. The air compressor kicked on a sudden, violent blast of pressurized air, and the sound hit Ethan like a fist. He was back in the vehicle. The dust. The noise. The door he could not find. His vision narrowed to a point, and his hands locked into fists, and he heard himself say, "Excuse me," in a voice that did not sound like his own. He walked out the back door and sat on an overturned crate, elbows on his knees, head in his hands, breathing in counts of 4 the way the army had taught him: in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. It did not help. The world would not come back into focus. He sat there for 10 minutes until his pulse slowed enough for him to stand, and then he got in his truck and drove away without going back inside. He drove home in silence. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Owen was asleep. Margaret had gone to bed. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, his hands flat on the surface, listening to the house settle. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. He could feel the letter from Megan's lawyer sitting in the drawer where he had shoved it, and it pulled at him like gravity. Then he heard a soft knock. Claire stood on the other side of the screen door, holding 2 mugs. "Saw your light was off, but your truck was home," she said. Figured you might need this." He opened the door and took the mug. Chamomile tea, hot and sweet. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The only light came from the street lamp outside. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Ethan set his mug down and said, in a voice scraped thin by exhaustion, "I can't hold a job, Claire. My hands won't stop shaking. I scream in my sleep and my kid hears it. The wall in my bedroom has a hole in it from my fist." He paused. "Megan has a house. She has a husband. She has a lawyer. What judge in the world would pick me?" Claire looked at him across the table. She wrapped both hands around her mug and was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what Owen told me last week?" she said. "He was sitting on my porch, petting Biscuit, and out of nowhere he said, 'My daddy reads to me every night, even when his hands shake. He never skips a page.'" She let the words settle in the dark kitchen. Then she leaned forward slightly and said, "You don't have to be whole to be somebody's home, Ethan." The sentence hung in the air. Ethan stared at her. In the dim light, her eyes were steady and certain and completely unafraid of him, and that more than the words themselves was what broke through. Not pity. Not advice. Just a woman who had lost her own person and rebuilt her own life, telling him, plainly, that being damaged was not the same as being disqualified. He did not argue. He did not walk away. He did not retreat into the silence he had been living in for 14 months. He picked up his tea and drank it, and he let her sit across from him in his mother's kitchen. And for the first time since he had come home, he did not feel the need to be alone. He called the VA clinic the next morning at 8 o'clock before he could talk himself out of it. The receptionist asked him what he needed, and he said, "Dr. Reeves, Claire Ashford told me to ask for him." They gave him an appointment for Tuesday. When Tuesday came, he sat in a small office across from a man with a gray beard and kind eyes, and for 50 minutes he said almost nothing. Dr. Reeves did not push. He sat in his chair with his hands folded and his patience seemingly infinite, and when the silence stretched past the point where most people would have filled it, he simply let it breathe. At the end, he shook Ethan's hand and said, "Same time next week?" Ethan said, "Okay." He had shown up. It was not much, but it was not nothing. That same week, Claire told him her older brother, Tom Ashford, owned a small auto repair shop in the next town. "He's been short-handed since April. He's not fancy, but he's fair." Ethan called, and Tom answered on the second ring. "Claire told me about you. Come in Thursday." On Thursday, Ethan drove to a 3-bay garage with a hand-painted sign that read, "Ashford Motors." Tom was a broad-shouldered man with Claire's same blue eyes and an easy way of talking that put Ethan slightly less on edge than usual. He handed Ethan a diagnostic scanner and pointed at a truck with a bad transmission. "Show me what you can do." Ethan's hands shook when he plugged in the scanner, but they steadied when he opened the hood. Tom noticed. He did not say anything. At the end of the day, he handed Ethan a shop key. "Claire doesn't vouch for just anyone. Be here Monday." That Saturday, Ethan went to the hardware store and bought lumber, hinges, a latch, and a can of white paint. He spent the day rebuilding the fence between his mother's yard and Claire's. He pulled out rotted posts and set new ones in concrete. He replaced leaning slats with straight boards and painted them white. But in the section where Owen always crawled through the gap, worn smooth by a small body passing through it every day for more than a year, he did something different. He did not close it up. He built a gate. It was small and simple, with a wooden latch that a 6-year-old could reach, and it swung open easily on oiled hinges. Claire came out when she heard the hammering stop. She walked across her yard and stood on the other side of the new fence, looking at the gate. "A gate?" she said, and there was something in her voice, surprise, amusement, and something softer she did not try to hide. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans. "Owen's gonna ruin his jeans crawling through that hole every day," he said, and he almost smiled. Claire looked at the gate, the fresh paint, the careful joints, The latch set at a child's height, and then she looked at him. "It's perfect," she said. They both understood that the gate was not only for Owen. 15 minutes later, Owen came barreling out of the house, saw the new fence, and ran straight for the gate. He flipped the latch, pushed it open, and sprinted across Claire's yard to where Biscuit was already bounding toward him. "Daddy made a door," he yelled, and the delight in his voice carried across both yards. And Ethan stood at the fence with a paintbrush in his hand and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. The custody hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in the Rappahannock County Courthouse, a red brick building with tall windows. Ethan wore his only suit, navy blue, slightly too big in the shoulders now, and a tie Margaret had pressed for him. Owen stayed with Claire, who had taken the day off. Margaret rode with Ethan and sat in the passenger seat with her purse in her lap and her back very straight, and did not say much, because there was not much to say. Megan was already there. She sat on the other side of the courtroom with her attorney. She looked different, her hair was shorter, and she wore a ring Ethan had not bought. Her new husband sat in the gallery, a quiet man who looked uncomfortable. Ethan did not hate her. She had left while he was gone and signed the papers without waiting for him, and she had not called Owen more than a handful of times in 14 months. But looking at her now, across the polished wood and the fluorescent light of a courtroom, he did not feel anger. He felt tired. Ethan's attorney was a young man named Harris from a veterans legal aid organization. He laid out the facts. Ethan had secured employment at Ashford Motors, attended weekly sessions at the VA, and maintained a stable home with his mother. He had community support, including a trusted neighbor who assisted with childcare. Harris presented pay stubs, appointment records, and a letter from Dr. Reeves. Megan's attorney presented her case: the house in Richmond, the income, the two-parent home. On paper, it was reasonable. Margaret was called to the stand. She spoke in a clear voice that did not waver. She told the court about the 14 months, about caring for Owen, about her health, about Claire's help. Then she spoke about Ethan. "My son came back from that war broken," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise. He has nightmares." His hands shake. There are days when getting out of bed is the hardest thing he does, but he didn't stay broken. He got a job. He went to the doctor. He fixed up our house. He reads to that boy every single night. She paused. He chose to get better. Not for himself. For Owen. The judge asked to speak with Owen. A court officer brought the boy into a small room adjacent to the courtroom. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and glasses, and she asked simple questions in a warm voice. Owen answered the way 6-year-olds answer, honestly and without strategy. He said he liked his room and his grandma's cooking and drawing pictures. He said his dad read to him every night. Then the judge asked if there was anything else he wanted to say. Owen thought about it. "My house has a new gate now," he said. The judge tilted her head. "A gate?" "Daddy built it," Owen said, "so I can go see Miss Claire and Biscuit without getting my jeans dirty." The courtroom was quiet. The judge looked at the boy, and something in her expression shifted not to pity, but to understanding. She had heard attorneys and documents all morning, but this was the thing that mattered. A father who noticed his son's jeans were getting dirty and built something to fix it. The ruling came without drama. The judge granted Ethan continued custody with conditions. Maintain employment, continue treatment, follow up in 6 months. Visitation was granted to Megan. It was over. Outside, Ethan called Claire. "We're coming home," he said. When they pulled into the driveway, Claire and Owen were on the porch steps. Owen ran to the truck before it stopped. Ethan lifted him and held him, and over his son's shoulder he looked at Claire. "He talked about the gate," he said, his voice rough. Claire smiled, her eyes bright. "He's proud of it." 3 months passed. The summer thinned and the evenings cooled and the light turned from white to gold, and the leaves on the old oak tree between the 2 houses began to show the first edges of amber. Ethan worked at Tom's shop 5 days a week. His hands still trembled on bad days, but bad days came less often now, and he had learned what to do with them: step outside, breathe, count to 10, go back in. Tom never mentioned it. The other mechanics never mentioned it. It was simply part of the rhythm of the shop, like the coffee that was always too strong and the radio that was always tuned to country. He saw Dr. Reeves every Tuesday. The nightmares had not stopped, but they came less often, and when they came he could sometimes surface without hitting the wall, without scaring Owen. On those nights, he sat on the edge of his bed and breathed. And after a while, he walked to Owen's room and stood in the doorway and watched his son sleep and reminded himself where he was. Millbrook, Virginia, home. The yard had changed. Where there had been weeds, there was mowed grass. Where the fence had leaned, there were straight white boards and a gate that swung easily. And in a bed along the south side of the porch, Ethan had planted roses, 3 bushes grown from cuttings Claire had given him. They were small, with only a few buds, but they were alive. Margaret said they made the house look like it was breathing again. Owen still went through the gate every day. He played with Biscuit and practiced his letters at Claire's kitchen table and helped her water the roses. On Saturday mornings, she taught him to bake muffins, and he brought them home on a plate, proud and covered in flour. The 4 of them ate dinner together every night. No one had made it official. No one needed to. On a Saturday evening in late September, Owen was at Claire's house and Margaret was in her recliner with her book. Ethan walked through the gate and knocked on Claire's back door. He had come to fix a cabinet hinge, a small job, 10 minutes. He finished and stood in her kitchen doorway, not leaving. Claire leaned against the counter. "You okay?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I don't know how to say things right. I never did, even before." He paused. But Owen was right. About the drawing. Claire tilted her head. "Which drawing?" "The one with 4 people in front of 2 houses," he said. "He drew it the first week I came home. 4 people, 2 houses, 1 fence with a gate." He looked at his hands, then at her. "I think he saw it before I did." Claire stepped away from the counter. She stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the small scar on her chin and the way her eyes caught the kitchen light. He held out his hand. It trembled, it always would, probably, for the rest of his life, and she placed her hand over his, and he let it stay. He did not pull away. For a long moment they stood in her kitchen, 2 people who had each lost the life they expected and found, in the wreckage, something neither of them had been looking for. Outside, the September light poured gold across 2 yards, separated by a white picket fence with a small wooden gate standing open. Margaret sat on her porch, her book closed in her lap, smiling at something only she could see. Owen sat in the grass between the 2 houses, bent over a new drawing, his biggest one yet. 4 people stood together. A white fence ran between 2 houses, and in the middle of the fence was a gate painted bright blue. A brown dog lay across the threshold, half on one side, half on the other. Red roses grew along the entire length of the fence, spilling from one yard into the next. Above it all, an enormous sun smiled down. Ethan and Claire stepped out onto her porch. They stood shoulder to shoulder and watched their boy draw in the last warm light of a summer that had changed everything. Biscuit lay at the gate, tail moving slowly, right where he always was, halfway between one home and the other, because to him they had always been the same. He came home from war thinking he had lost everything, but on the other side of a white picket fence, someone had been watering flowers, reading to his son, and waiting not for a hero, but for a man brave enough to open the gate.